For the Greeks, the Egyptians, the later Persians, and the later Egyptians, and then Africans and everybody else, it seemed pretty obvious that the world was a sphere in the last 2,000 years. But the question is, if the world had been known all this time as a sphere, did the ancient Egyptians know this? Now, I made a video a long time ago talking about why some people believe that they didn't. And then I was going to make one about how they did, but I forgot. Now, if we look at some of the depictions from around the world that depict the zodiac and they depict the spheres of the earth, we can tell that not only did everybody know this, but they mixed it with ancient mythology, especially related to a previous flat earth that was believed. Now, it might not be completely true that the ancient Egyptians all believed the earth was a sphere, but at least some of them did. Although we can see depictions of the sun being displayed as a disk, some people argue that from whatever angle you look at it, you can still see the entire sun. And this would not make sense if it was not a ball. Take the depiction, for example, of Apis from front view. You can clearly see that from this point of view, the disc is head up. But even depicted from the side, you can see that he is head up. Now, of course, there's an obvious problem here, which is Apis's horns are also turned, which makes this argument pretty weak. Now, the obvious question is, why use the sun when you could use the moon or the earth? Well, the answer is the moon is no better. It is depicted either as a disk, the same as the sun, or as the broken moon. And even in that case, it is still depicted as a flat thing. But what about the earth? Well, there are actually three types of depictions of the earth in ancient Egypt, and one is more interesting than the others. Geb is the one at the bottom, and interestingly, this gives us nothing in terms of information. Even if we look inside of this, we can see that Ra is depicted inside of the earth rather than outside. It gives us a very confusing thought about what they thought of Egypt, but it seems pretty clear that they thought that the sky was a solid surface, first of all, and then they thought that the earth was a flat surface depicted as Geb, and then you have the atmosphere. This is a well-known depiction of ancient Egypt. The second is the Turin papyrus map and maps in general. These show obviously that the earth has got dips and all of that, but you can tell that just by standing on the earth, you can see it. These maps do not, again, give us any indication that the ancient Egyptians knew that the world was round. Again, a very interesting fact. But is that because of practicality or knowledge? It seems that a lot of scholars believe the ancient Egyptians actually believed that the world was round. And the reason why they believe this is because of the ancient Greeks. This image here is called the Denderi zodiac, and quite clearly it shows the earth as what they call a perisphere, or a sphere depicted in a flat way, because of course the surface is flat. But this sphere is surrounded by Egyptian gods rather than the gods of the Greeks or Romans. For some, it clearly shows that the Greeks and the Romans believed that the ancient Egyptians already knew about the spherical earth. And at no point do you see them remove this claim and claim that the ancient Egyptians had no idea that they actually believed in a flat earth. Instead, they seem to credit them along the way for going as far as they did in their study of the universe. One of the things that suck about this here depiction is that it's in the Louvre. It was stolen from ancient Egypt and put there. In 2022, Zahi Hawass, ahead with the Rosetta Stone, asked for them in a serious way for them to be returned back to Egypt. The story that I believe 100% proves that the ancient Egyptians at least had a clue that the world was round is the story about the Phoenicians circumnavigating the globe. And the way they prove it is by looking at the global bodies, the sun, and looking at it where it came from and which direction. And this is a known fact that this happened. Herodotus puts this in his book, and Herodotus is not far off from Pythagoras, the first person who they suggest put the idea out there that the earth was a sphere. Now, it is not clear to everybody why the people would be interested at all whether the earth was a sphere or not, but clearly there is evidence that they did at least think it was possible.
Pretty much everybody knew the earth was a sphere before that. It's just nobody could prove it until the ancient Egyptians sent a fleet of ships around Africa, and they completely circumnavigated Africa. And what they noticed 2,600 years ago is as they were traveling south, the sun's position moved from being in the southern sky directly overhead to the northern sky. And the constellations changed to constellations they'd never seen before. And then as they came around the southern tip of Africa and started heading north, the sun slowly moved from the northern sky or directly overhead back to the southern sky, and their old constellations returned, and they went, there's literally only one shape that could accommodate that experience. The earth is clearly a sphere.
Scientists know today that because the earth is a sphere, the sun sets in the right hand side, even though it is still the west in the northern hemisphere, and it sets on the left hand side, even though it is still the west. This is a mirror effect, by the way, and it proves that the earth is a sphere. Of course, the sun rises in the east, which is the left in the northern hemisphere, and the right in the southern hemisphere. Now, as smart as the Greeks were, they had no idea about this information until the Egyptians provided it to them. There was no other true investigation or true writing that depicted this level of accuracy. Now, we will revisit this after I read the quick part of Herodotus explaining this. Now, keep in mind, you could say Herodotus was Greek and therefore he must have known and blah, blah, but he was skeptical of this idea. He believed that the Phoenicians that reported to the Egyptians that they saw the sun change direction were lying. And here it is. It says, when 2 years had thus passed, in the third, having doubled the pillars of Hercules, they arrived in Egypt and related what to me does not seem credible. Keep that in mind. So the pillars of Hercules are in Morocco and Europe, and they're going past this area. And he says, to me, this does not seem credible because, of course, he believed in a flat earth, but made to others that as they sailed round Libya, so as they sailed round Libya, they had the sun on their right. So the sun was on their right hand side, which makes sense today. There's no way they could have made up this information. because there's no one who knew this information at this time. And then it says, thus was Libya first known. Subsequently, the Carthaginians say that the Libya is surrounded by water. We do not need to read the rest because it's just narrative, but I want to focus on this very small part, which is Libya here reflects Africa. So the word Libya is being used as the entire continent of Africa. And so these guys sailed around Africa, and they said when they were sailing around Africa in the southern hemisphere, suddenly the sun was to their right, which obviously means they're used to the sun being on their left. So, to make this clear, this is something you would not be able to tell just by moving from Egypt to India or anything like that, because this is a difference between the southern hemisphere and the northern hemisphere. Had they crossed over through Egypt and went through Congo and went all the way around, they still wouldn't have seen this. The only place they could be talking about in this idea that the sun turned to the right and turned to the left means that they must have crossed further south to places like southern Africa, and then of course claiming that it's surrounded by water, which means they must have circled the entire thing. Now, here's the problem: the art does not change. You don't see the solar disk becoming a ball or anything like that immediately. But that is not proof that they did not know the earth was round. They knew from this day on, they just knew, because there is no other explanation. Even on the flat earth, there is no other explanation that can explain why this happens outside of the earth being a sphere. This trip, this journey around Africa, has been quoted several times in history by both the ancients and modern people, which gives us a clue that people were feeding off of this journey and the clues that it came up with. And that is one of the reasons why they believe that the earth was a globe, or that it was a round. Now, I did mention that there was a third shape of the earth depicted by the ancient Egyptians. Now, don't allow this one to take away from what I talked about previously, but it is important that, as vague as this one is, it is something that still should be taken seriously. Now, Plutarch, a Greco Roman, explains to us that the histories and the sciences of the ancient Egyptian are veiled. In other words, they are depicted in myth rather than said explicitly. This is one of the things that is confusing, because today we want people to say they believe this explicitly and they believe that explicitly. Otherwise, we don't take it as serious. But what Plutarch is saying here is that the ancient Egyptians had tons of knowledge which they talked about later, but this knowledge that they already knew was shrouded, veiled in their mythology, not for every ear. In his works Moralia, Plutarch writes about Isis and Osiris, and then he says this: the kings were appointed from the priests or from the military class, since the military class had eminence and honor because of valor, and the priests because of wisdom. But he who was appointed from the military class was at once made one of the priests and a participant in their philosophy. Indicator number one, by the way, this means that not everyone believed the philosophies that were spouted by the ancient Egyptians. This is based on what Plutarch is saying. But this is the next part, which for the most part is veiled in myth and in words containing dim reflections and adumbrations of the truth. In other words, the veiled Isis. This veiled Isis is a very important image. And the reason why it is important is because they, the Greeks and the Greco Romans, just specifically, spent the rest of their time trying to translate these by speaking to Egyptians back to a way that a normal person can understand, someone who does not need to understand the philosophy. The veiled Isis had this written under it: I am all that has been, and is, and shall be, and no mortal has ever lifted my mantle. This speaks of the hidden realities. And this brings me to the spherical sun, the first actual depiction and proof that they knew that the sun was a sphere. So keep in mind, this is not a depiction of the earth. But one of the arguments that I once made a long time ago, and I think it's an important one, is that the sun is always depicted as a disk. But this is not always true, because one of the animals used by the ancient Egyptians to depict the sun is a dung beetle. So, for those of you that don't know, the scarab beetle is a type of dung beetle, and it rolls a ball. And this ball, in the interpretations of the ancient Egyptian, was a symbol of the sun, and it's moving from left to right or east to west. So, in the very same book that Plutarch talks about the Egyptians being veiled, he speaks of this beetle and its meaning. So we can read: the Egyptians also honored the asp and the weasel and the beetle, since they observed in them certain dim likeness of the power of the gods, like images of the sun in drops of water. There are still many people who believe and declare that the weasel conceives through its ear and brings forth its young by the way of the mouth, and that this is a parallel of the generation of speech. The race of beetles has no female, but all the males eject their sperm into the ear pellet of the material, which they roll up by pushing it from the opposite side, just as the sun seems to turn the heavens in the direction opposite to its own course, which is from west to east. They compare the asp to lightning, since it does not grow old and manages to move with ease and suppleness without the use of limbs. Khepri is a sun god with the face of a dung beetle or a scarab beetle. And you can see here the similarities that they point out between the sun and the dung beetle. It is not merely a small thing. Now, it is important that also, not only did they realize that the dung beetle was related to the sun in direction, but also it rolling the dung around in the dirt reminded them of the sun god Khepri moving the earth from left to right. So the sun, in this case, is seen as a ball moving from left to right rather than a disk. And it is possible that the reason why it looks like a disk from any angle is because they were obeying their 2D style that is depicted on the walls rather than depicting a disk. As we can see in other versions of the sun, that they actually have shape to them. And of course, there's more depictions of the sun. These multiple depictions obviously give us an indicator of what was meant, but actually, experts have come to the conclusion, based on the writings of the ancient Egyptians, that of course they thought the sun was a sphere. So let's read this from Cambridge. A description of this object or artwork. This image shows a scarab beetle, an amazing creature that was very special to the ancient Egyptians. It is a kind of dung beetle. It uses others' animals' poo to get its nutrients from and to lay its eggs in. After the mother beetle had left and some time had passed, the eggs would hatch and the baby beetles would emerge from the dung. Ancient Egyptians thought that these animals must be very special because they seem to be born without having any parents. Some scarab beetles are able to roll huge balls of dung around using their strong back legs. The movement reminded the ancient Egyptians of the movement of the sun. Khepri was a scarab beetle god who they believed rolled the sun into the sky each morning. This name means the one who comes into being. In other words, the one who comes to life. Recently, scientists have demonstrated that dung beetles have another fascinating connection with the sun. They use it to navigate, making sure they are pushing their dung balls in a straight line. It is quite clear that the ancient Egyptians thought that the sun was a ball, at least at some point. So, of course, the question is it's fine if they think the sun is a ball, but what does this do? Well, at least it tells us that they believe that some of the heavenly bodies could be spherical. Add that with the information that they used the sun to figure out that the earth was spherical because of the right to left thing. And you can see here again the right to left thing or east to west thing that you see depicted by the dung beetles. It's a very important thing that they talk about. In another part of Plutarch's writing, he writes about Anubis, who is the horizon. And as you know, the horizon touches around, as he will quote as well. And he mentions that the horizon at the same time can touch daytime and nighttime at the exact same time. This, of course, is another feature of the round earth. The fact that we know that the earth, right, in some parts when it's daytime, it's nighttime. So we read, when Nephthys gave birth to Anubis, Isis treated the child as if it were her own. For Nephthys is that which is beneath the earth and is invisible. Isis, that which is above the earth and is visible. So we take Isis, who is visible, right? And the circle which touches these, called the horizon. So the circle touches these two areas and it's called the horizon. Of course, we all know the horizon goes around the earth. Being common to both, has received the name Anubis and is represented in the form like a dog. For the dog can see with his eyes both by night and by day alike. And among the Egyptians, Anubis is thought to possess this faculty. Now, it's not purely just symbolic, because Nephthys is actually known as the god of night. And so the separation between the underworld and the overworld is also seen as the separation between the daytime and the nighttime. The Weeping Sisters, also known as Nephthys and Isis, are seen here depicted. And Isis is depicted in a lighter brown color, and she is the lighter sister of these two groupings. The darker sister is Nephthys, as she represents the nighttime, and you can see them separated here in a beautiful way. These weeping sisters cried over their murdered brother Osiris. Plutarch is seen as a good source of translations of the ancient Egyptian religion, because we must remember that the ancient Egyptians were naturalists and animists, which means a lot of what they were saying was hidden. But there's still one more, as I mentioned, the earth and what it looked like. And this is related to a lot of the pyramid ideas, which even Isaac Newton put out there, that the pyramid or the pyramids have some kind of mathematics that might be an indicator of what the earth might have looked like. So Isaac Newton is the first to suggest, who is from the West, that the pyramids actually reveal the shape of the earth using mathematics. And you can see him struggling to make these measurements of the pyramids equate to the earth. Now, is there any reason why he would believe this? Well, one, we know that the Greeks themselves said that the ancient Egyptians didn't do anything without purpose, and they hid their knowledge of nature, of science, in a veil of mythology. And so it would not be ridiculous to assume this. But let's start with a very simple question, which is there any reason why the ancient Egyptians would hide the sphere of the earth in a triangle, in a pyramid shape? The only explanation that makes sense is the mound of creation. Let's first read this before I talk about that. The sun rises from the mound of creation at the beginning of time. The central circle represents the mound, and the three orange circles are the sun in different stages of rising. At the top of the horizon, hieroglyphics with the sun appearing atop it. At either side are the goddesses of the north and south, pouring out the waters that surround the mound. The earth stick figures are the gods of the Ogdod, hoeing the soil, the creation of the world detail in the book of the dead. The only explanation that makes sense to combine the pyramid shapes with the earth, the spherical earth, is if the ancient Egyptians were talking about Benben. Benben is the ancient word for the mound that first came out in Egypt, depicted in many places in Egypt later as a pyramid shape. This mound represented the first land to emerge from the Noon. The Noon represents the waters that surround the earth. And so it is possible that the reason why they would hide the secrets of the earth, the sphere, within the pyramid is because they were trying to do something that people would later try to do, which is they were trying to reconcile the shape, the pyramid, the mound, the original shape of the earth, the mound, with the sphere shape of the earth. So they figured out that the earth is a sphere, and they were like, how do we make a triangle be a sphere? And this might be what Isaac Newton was alluding to. This, of course, is very controversial, but there is at least a line that shows that the original Earth, in which the Earth comes from, the pyramid shape, and the original and the later Earth, the spherical Earth, has some kind of real commonality that was seen by the ancient Egyptians, accepted by the ancient Egyptians. Now, obviously, all of these theories are deeper than what I just explained, and I could go deeper into it, but I needed to fit all three of these inside one video, and that is why I will talk about it another day. Thank you. Like, share, subscribe. By the way, there's a video in YouTube that talks about how one of the ancient Greeks used the results of Egypt to come up with these conclusion of a round earth, which means the Greeks probably copied the idea of the round earth from the ancient Egyptians. I will link this video in there. It is a very interesting video.